Hey art friends, and welcome to another weekly art video. I hope you're having an amazing day and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be taking you through my entire watercolor pencil painting process for this realistic fruit still life piece. I've broken down my process for this one into 6 main phases, and these are the phases that I go through whenever I'm creating any watercolor pencil piece. As I'm explaining all of the steps that I go through, I'm going to be sharing my must-know tips for greater success with watercolor pencil, as well as the techniques that I love and the hacks that I almost always bring in for greater success. In terms of my style that I like going for when I am using watercolor pencils, I love developing a level of realism, developing a wide range of values and adding dimension to the elements involved, while embracing and bringing in a level of texture that's so particular to watercolor pencils. I also almost always love using a limited color palette, and for this one I use a total of 7 different colors. Now, if you're just getting started with watercolor pencils, I would highly recommend checking out another video that I shared a few months ago, in which I share a ton of must-know information on this very versatile medium, what makes it different from traditional watercolor paint, the type of paper that I like using and why, essential techniques that you should know about, and a whole bunch of information that you're going to find incredibly helpful. I'm going to make sure to leave a link to that video down below in the description box so that you can go and check it out if you haven't already. Alright, so without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight in. This is the reference photo that I'm going to be using for this piece. I took this reference photo at home myself several months ago, and it was sitting in my photo reference library waiting to be used, and I came across it the other day when I was searching for a reference photo, and I thought it would make for a great watercolor pencil piece. Okay, so getting into the specific colors that I'm going to be using for this piece. As I said, I used a total of 7 different colors, and these are all colors from my Goldfaber Aqua set from Faber-Castell. The colors that I'm going to be using are cadmium yellow, dark chrome yellow, burnt ochre, dark cadmium orange, blue violet, Van Dyke brown, and cold gray 4. You do not need to use these exact same colors that I'm going to be using to arrive at amazing results. I'm going to be swatching out these colors on a scrap piece of watercolor paper for you so that you can see what they look like on paper and choose whatever you have that's available, that you have on hand, that's most similar to my colors. Okay, so first things first, and before getting started with the painting process, I always make time to choose the colors that I'm going to be using for the piece on hand and to test them out on a scrap piece of watercolor paper. And when it comes to using watercolor pencils, because I personally do like bringing in water and a paintbrush to activate that color, which, by the way, I'm just going to be using one paintbrush for this process, and it's going to be a size 10 round brush. I also test out what they look like once they've been activated, because when it comes to watercolor pencils, you can certainly be surprised by how that color changes when you activate it with water. Right here, I've taken out 6 different colors from my watercolor pencil set, and the only one that I'm going to be missing is the gray that I'm going to be using in the cast shadow and occlusion shadow areas on the surface, which I'm going to bring in at the end of this process. I'm going to test out these 6 colors on my scrap piece of watercolor paper, and I'm going to activate them with my paintbrush and a little bit of water as well, just to see what they look like. I am a huge believer in limiting the amount of colors that we're going to be using for any kind of piece, and I'm always looking for ways to repeat colors in different areas of my painting or repeat colors in different color mixtures. So perhaps I am using the same color to develop darkest values throughout many different elements. I love doing this because keeping things limited really makes everything look more harmonious and cohesive at the end, and makes it much more likely that I'm not going to arrive at colors that I'm not really looking for. Color plays a huge role in making a visual composition look harmonious and cohesive, and if we randomly pick colors throughout the painting process, this can make the piece not look very well integrated at the end, and we can accidentally create colors that we weren't looking for. Alright, so right here I'm activating these colors with a little bit of water and my size 10 round brush, just to make sure that I'm not going to need anything else. What I am thinking about when I am selecting my colors, aside from what I was just mentioning about trying to keep things limited and thinking of how I'm going to be repeating different colors in my different mixtures, layering colors in different ways, etc., is I want to make sure that I am setting myself up for success with a range of colors that is going to enable me to create lightest value areas, a wide range of midtones, and darkest dark areas. Because as I said in the beginning, I'm going for a semi-realistic look here. And in order to develop higher levels of realism, value or tone is really number one, even above color correctness. Everywhere throughout your piece, in all of the elements included, background, if it has a background, etc., there should be a range of values everywhere. You have to pay attention to the light situation going on in the reference photo. You have to be able to pinpoint light areas, midtone areas, and darkest dark areas. And you can simplify values if you want into just 3. Lights, midtones, and darks, but it is essential that you're able to pinpoint these in your reference photo or whatever it is that you have in front of you in real life so that you can make those values or tones happen in your drawing or painting. That is what's going to give something a sense of three-dimensional form, a sense of depth, a sense of light and shadow. If we're not able to pinpoint those values and make them happen in our artwork, then it's very likely that our artwork is not going to look very realistic. It's going to look pretty flat. This is why it's always essential as well to stem from a great reference photo. As I was picking these different colors from my watercolor pencil set, I was observing that reference photo and noticing not only the colors or hues that I see in that reference photo, the browns, the yellows, the oranges, but also the location of the different values or tones present throughout these different elements. And so by paying attention to hue, which is just another fancy word for color, and value, otherwise known as tone. With those things in mind, I chose my different colors that I believed were going to help me recreate those different values and also the hues that I saw. So I see a few bright yellow spots throughout these pears, and this is why I made sure to choose a light, bright yellow that's a little bit cooler. Then I chose a slightly darker yellow that's a little bit warmer. I also see a similar color to that in those pears. Then I have a lighter brown and a darker brown. With those 4 colors, I know that I'm covered for value because I have lighter colors, I have medium colors, and I have a darker color. So just with those 4 alone, I'm going to be able to create a sense of roundness and 3D-ness in those pears. However, I decided to bring in a reddish orange as well because I do see a little bit of a reddish or orangish hue in certain sections of those pears. To develop hue and value throughout the basket, I'm going to be using my darker yellow, my lighter brown, and my darker brown, and repeating those same colors that I'm already going to be using in my pears. I chose a wild card color, which is something that I often do when painting with watercolor pencil. For this one, I chose purple as a wild card color, and I'm going to be bringing in this purple into darkest value areas. And I'm going to do this in all of the different elements throughout the piece to intensify those darkest value areas and bring in an extra pop of color for greater interest and to add a little more expression to the piece. I thought of bringing in this blue violet because since I'm going to be using plenty of yellows and yellow oranges in this piece, purple and blue purple are complementary to yellow and yellow orange in the color wheel. By playing with complementary colors, I can not only create great contrast, but an interesting use of color. At the end of this painting process, in phase 6, when I get to work on the shadow on the surface that these pears and the basket are on, you're going to see me swatch out a couple of different grays, and I'm going to choose the one that I'm going to go with. But I'll also be using the brown and the purple in the shadow on top of that gray. which is going to help me intensify the occlusion shadow area nearest the subjects and further bring everything together. All right, so now that I have my outline sketch ready and I have my colors pre-selected, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the layering process. When it comes to working with this medium, I always work from lightest color and I make my way gradually towards the darkest color. And what's the lightest color that I have chosen for the pears? It's the brightest, lightest yellow. So what I'm doing right now is I am starting to gently, lightly layer this yellow little by little. I'm not pressing down very hard at all on my paper, and I am gently starting to apply this yellow where I see this color in that reference photo. As I am applying this lightest color, I'm also taking note of the lightest value areas in these pears in the reference photo. The highlight areas, if you will. And I am trying to apply little to no color in those highlight sections. Why? Because just like when I am painting with traditional watercolor paint, I am incorporating the whiteness and the brightness of the paper as the highlights in this piece. And this paper is also going to help me develop those lightest value areas by simply leaving more of that paper shining through. And I am going to do this, I'm going to be protecting those lighter value areas by making sure that I'm not applying very much color in these areas at all, little to none. This is why when we're working with traditional watercolor paint and watercolor pencils, there is no need to bring in white color or white paint. To do this though, it's very important that you notice those lightest value areas so that you plan them and keep them protected throughout the painting process. Alright, so once I finished applying that lightest, brightest yellow throughout the pears, and I also added in a little bit of that brightest yellow and that metallic little detail in the basket, I changed on over to my next darker color, which is my darker yellow, which is a little bit more on the warmer side. And I applied that darker yellow in mid-tone sections throughout these pears, where I'm able to see warmer, more orangish, or very light warm brown hues. You can see how I left my lighter value sections, so sections where I have that white paper shining through, and sections where I want to leave only the lightest, brightest yellow shining through uncovered with this new layer of color. Once I was done with that second yellow, it was time to change to my next darker color that I'm going to be using inside of the pears. And this color is my burnt ochre, which is my lighter brown. And at this point in the process, I am focusing on the darker midtones. So I'm really only layering this burnt ochre in sections that I'm looking to deepen and darken in darker midtone areas. I'm not trying to cover up all of the previous colors and values that I've already developed. I'm trying to add or amplify the range of values that I'm developing. You're not trying to take away values or subtract values from all of that value work that you've already done. You're trying to add to that range of values, developing darker values, but leaving all of the previous lighter values shining through in those sections that need them. And I do this by focusing on only adding in this next color, which is already a medium color. I'm only placing it and layering it in darker midtone areas. You can see how I also added in this light brown in the stems. I'm going to be using my two different browns in the stems. And once I was done with that lighter brown, I switched on over to my darker brown, which is my Van Dyke brown. This is the darkest color that I'm going to be using in the pears. So at this point, I'm really making sure to only layer this color in the very darkest value areas that I'm able to perceive in that reference photo, leaving all of the previous colors and values shining through in lighter midtone areas, and of course, keeping the lightest value areas protected. I'm also going to be using this darker brown in little sections in the stems that I want to darken so that even the stems include at least a couple of different values. So at this point in the process, now that I've brought in lighter colors, medium colors, and darker colors, and I've applied those colors in these different sections of my pears, taking into account the values that I'm seeing in that reference photo, you can see how I'm starting to develop a more believable look. I have highlight areas in my piece where I've left the paper completely shining through, uncovered with any color. I have lighter value areas where I have just that brightest, lightest yellow. I I have lighter mid-tone sections where I have layered some of that second darker yellow on top of the lighter yellow. I have darker mid-tone areas where I have applied that lighter brown, and I have darkest value areas where I have brought in the darkest brown. Now that I am happy with the value development throughout the pears, I bring in a little bit of this reddish orange to make certain sections of my pears a little bit warmer, a little bit reddish. I'm only applying a very light layer of red though. And because this red is what you could refer to as a medium color, it inherently has a medium value. I make sure to apply this color only in mid-tone areas and darkest dark areas, but I don't apply it in lighter value areas because it can alter those lighter values that I want to keep protected, and it can darken them. I don't want to do that. Just to finish up this part of the process with these pears here, I finally went back to my initial brightest yellow just to do a little bit more layering, softening transitions between lightest value areas and midtones, perhaps making my highlights a little bit smaller if I feel they're too large, and applying a little bit more of this brightest yellow in sections that I feel I need a little bit more color in. I have kept my pressure nice and light and just focused on doing the layering in the darkest value sections. I don't want to start damaging or burnishing my paper, especially not in these beginning phases of the painting process, because once the paper has been burnished and you have altered the tooth or the texture of the paper doesn't take that pigment the same way. So if you're going to do any type of burnishing, leave it for the later stages of the painting process when we're almost done. Okay, so I finished up with the work that I would be doing in the pears in this part of the process, and it was time to get started with developing my values and doing my layering in the basket itself. And in the basket, I'm going to be using mostly my two different browns, and then I'm going to bring in my purple as well for shadow areas. So what you're seeing me do right now is I am getting started with my lighter brown, which is my burnt ochre. And I am applying this lighter brown all throughout the basket except for the highlight sections where I want little to no pigment. For my highlights in the basket, I am mostly leaving the upper lip or upper edge of the basket free of color, as well as the side planes of that handle. I oftentimes leave larger shapes for my highlights free of color than what I actually want them to be at the end, and I make them smaller throughout the process. Just keeping a larger shape protected initially gives me more control. Why? Because we're actually going to be activating this color with water and a paintbrush later. And if you just leave very, very small highlight shapes, it's a lot easier for you to accidentally cover up that area with pigment, because you're going to be moving around that pigment so much on paper when you're doing your color activation. If you have initially a larger highlight shape, you can make it smaller and there is less of an issue because you're still going to have at least somewhat of a bright white highlight at the end. By the way, quick tip here, if you go in with your watercolor pencil and you accidentally cover up a lighter value section or a highlight, go ahead and use a soft graphite eraser. Just make sure that it is clean, and you're going to be able to remove that color. If not entirely, you're going to be able to remove a good amount of it. As long as you haven't activated that color with water, you're going to be able to remove lots of that color. All right, so going back to the work that I am doing here in the basket, after I had applied my lighter brown, keeping highlights protected of course, I switched on over to my darker brown. This is my Van Dyke brown that I am using right now, and I am focusing on deepening and darkening dark shadow areas that I'm able to see in that reference photo, and only doing this layering and this application of my darker brown on top of that lighter brown in deep shadow areas. Almost done with this phase of the painting process. Now I'm going in with my wild card color, which is my purple that I'm going to be using in the deepest, darkest shadow areas. So I am using this purple only in certain shadow sections, the darkest ones that I'm able to see in that reference photo, where I've already applied my darkest brown. Continuing to do my layering with this purple in darkest value areas that I'm able to see in that reference photo. And right here, you're gonna see me go in with my soft graphite eraser, and I'm gonna erase out some pigment that I accidentally placed in an area that should be a little bit lighter. As I said, as long as the pigment has not been activated with water, you're always going to be able to go back in with a soft graphite eraser to at least remove some of it. And I'm going in one last time with my darkest brown to make sure that I have enough of this color placed in my darkest value areas before moving on to the next phase of the process, where we're going to be doing our first activation with a paintbrush and water. I want to make sure that I have a good amount of pigment already on my paper and that I'm happy with the range of values that I've developed before moving on to the color activation. All right, so moving into phase number 2, and this is where we're going to be doing our first activation with a paintbrush and a little bit of water. So when it comes to activating watercolor pencil pigment, we really don't need much water in our paintbrush at all. I am just taking a little bit of water at a time from my container, and as you can see, I have this absorbent towel to my right that I am using to constantly dab off the excess water off my paintbrush bristles. With just a little bit of water in my paintbrush, I am going in and gently starting to run my paintbrush bristles over that pigment. You can see how as I am running my paintbrush bristles over that pigment, I am activating it and I am being left with a more painterly effect. I'm still left with a little bit of a texture because that pigment was applied on paper via a pencil, but by just running those damp paintbrush bristles over this pigment, that water-soluble pigment becomes more like traditional watercolor paint, and oftentimes that color is going to deepen and darken or become brighter. Those colors that you have layered on top of each other or have applied next to each other are going to blend and merge together. I do want to provide a couple of tips here for greater success when it comes to activating color. Because I know that this is the part of the process that I had, I think, most trouble with in the beginning. It definitely required some practice and some getting used to, but here are the things that really helped me advance my skills and have definitely helped me arrive at better results. So aside from making sure that you're not going in with too much water in your paintbrush bristles, make sure that you're working in sections and doing your activation of color starting in lightest value or color areas and making your way towards the darker color or darkest value areas. Why? Because if you start in the darkest color areas and you move your paintbrush towards the lighter value areas, it's very likely that you're going to mess up your lighter values, because you're going to pull that darker color into the lighter value sections and you're going to cover those up or darken them. And that's definitely not something that you want, especially not after all of this work that you've done with developing all of your different value sections. And another essential tip for success when activating your pigment with water is you want to always pay attention to how you're pushing and pulling your pigment around on paper. The moment that you see that you're starting to pull or push too much pigment into an area that you don't want it, you want to remove that color from your paintbrush bristles by swiveling your paintbrush in your container of water, removing that excess water, and continuing with a clean paintbrush. I am constantly removing that pigment that is starting to collect in my paintbrush bristles as I am doing all of this activation work, because I don't want to get that color into areas that I don't need it. If you just continue activating that color, pushing and pulling that pigment around without noticing what is going on and without paying attention to those different value areas and continuing to observe that reference photo, it's very likely that you're going to flatten everything out and completely demolish all of the value work that you've already been working so hard on. So pay attention to what is happening and make sure that you're constantly removing that pigment that is collected in your paintbrush bristles whenever necessary. I want you to notice how I was definitely left with some texture, a little bit of splotchiness here and there. I'm not worried about that very much at all because I'm still going to be applying more layers of color on top of this. If I go in and start fussing with every single section of my piece, I can run the risk of overworking my painting and damaging my paper, and I don't want to do that. Most of those little splotches and little textures are going to disappear later on. Not the textures created by the pencil, that's perfectly fine and I actually like that, but I mean the little splotches. As long as they're not huge splotches, they will probably disappear, so there's really no sense in trying to go in and correct them. When it came to activating those stems, which are very narrow little shapes here, I made sure to go in with just the tip of my paintbrush. All right, so I'm all done here. I'm going to allow everything to dry completely. Feel free to help yourself with a hair dryer if you want to speed up that drying process, but it is very important that you allow everything to dry completely because the next part of this process, phase number 3, has to be done on paper that is completely dry. Moving into phase number 3, and the objective with this part of the process is to focus on pushing darker midtones and darkest dark areas through more layering of color. And because we're only focusing on the darker areas, I'm no longer going to be using my lightest yellow in the Pears. So I am getting started with doing more layering with the darker yellow, and I'm not going to be doing any more layering in lightest value sections. As you can see, I am keeping those highlight sections protected, and I am still leaving certain sections with just that initial lightest, brightest yellow. I am keeping that uncovered. I'm only doing more layering in darker value areas. After having done more color application with that darker yellow, I switched on over to my lighter brown, my burnt ochre, and I did more layering in mid-tone areas. When I'm done with this burnt ochre, I'm going to switch on over to my darkest brown, my Van Dyke brown, and I'm going to focus on only using this darkest brown in the very darkest value areas that I'm able to see in that reference photo. The darker I get with my color, the smaller the shapes that I'm creating with that color. So by this point in the process, you can get an idea of how my entire method for creating a believable sense of volume in these elements, of light and shadow, of dimension, if you will, is really all about doing the majority of the layering in the darkest areas and keeping the lightest areas free of any color or with very little color in them. With this method, I am able to create a lot of dimension and a level of realism that I love, but because I am incorporating that brightness of the paper and I am allowing it to help me create those lighter value areas, I'm also going to be left with a painting that looks light and glowy. Okay, so once I finished with the Pears, I got to work on the basket again. And I am going to be bringing in my lighter brown and my darker brown. You're going to notice how I am leaving plenty of those initial values and colors shining through in the lighter value sections, and I am focusing on developing those darker shadow shapes. As I am applying this color, I am exerting less and less pressure as I make my way out towards the lighter value areas. Not that I am applying very much pressure at all, but I do make sure that in order to create a gradient where the more saturated darker color gradually turns into the lighter paler color, I make sure that I am releasing that pressure and applying less and less as I move out and away from the darker value zones. So it's really just about covering up that paper more in darker value areas, right? And the things that are going to allow you to cover up that paper more in darker value areas is doing more layering and applying slightly more pressure in those areas versus not doing much layering at all and applying less pressure in lighter value areas. As I am developing all of these different values, the lighter values, the mid-tone values, the darkest values, I am really acknowledging all of these areas in my photo as abstract, irregular shapes. I'm also staying away from creating any type of outline anywhere because outlines are not present in real life and they would flatten things out. I'm jumping around the entire piece and moving quickly and not being overly perfectionistic about replicating every single thing the way that I see it in that reference photo. Even though I'm using a reference photo, it's not my intention to create a carbon copy of it. And I also know that my different value shapes can be slightly different from what I am seeing in that reference photo. They can be slightly smaller or slightly larger. The shape can be a little bit different. And as long as I develop a wide range of values that are similar to what I am seeing in that reference photo, and I'm bringing to mind the three-dimensional structure of these elements that I am painting, as well as a light situation of the environment that they are in, so that the lights and the shadows make sense and are consistent throughout the piece, I'm going to end up with something that looks believable. This video is sped up for the most part, and it took me a little bit over an hour to create this piece. But I like working relatively quickly, and I was jumping around the entire piece, not being overly perfectionistic about anything. And as long as I am paying attention to these things, I can work pretty quickly and even integrate expressive lines and marks and such. And I'm still able to arrive at a level of realism that I really like. Okay, so I am working in the intersection of that basket, and there are very, very deep shadow areas in here, so I'm doing plenty of layering in this area. I'm doing my best to notice value changes in the inner part of the basket in that reference photo, and layering even more color in those deepest shadow shapes. Notice how I didn't really do any more layering in a lot of those areas in the upper section of the basket where the light is able to hit directly. I wanted to make sure that those areas had a very light application of color, so I didn't force myself to go in and add any more color in this phase of the process. Alright, so time to move into phase number 4, where we're going to be doing our second activation of color using a paintbrush and a little bit of water. This second activation should be a lot quicker than the first, because we're really just activating that new color that we just placed in the previous phase. The same information applies here that I mentioned in the previous color activation phase. You want to make sure that you are starting in the lighter value areas and making your way into darker value areas, and that you're paying attention to how much pigment is collecting in your paintbrush bristles and how you're pushing and pulling that paint around on your paper so that you can remove that pigment from your paintbrush bristles whenever necessary and get back to work with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush. Continue helping yourself with your absorbent towel or regular kitchen paper towel, whatever it is that you have on hand, and make sure that you're staying on top of water control. I would also recommend embracing the texture left behind by the pencils and to not try to go in and get rid of all of that texture. If you do, you can accidentally overwork your piece, damage your paper, or create splotchy effects. Plus, isn't that the beauty of watercolor pencils, that you can incorporate both painterly effects as well as a kind of texture that can only be created via the application of color with pencils? I think that combo is a beautiful thing, and it can make for a very interesting looking style. Alright, so with that second application done, it was time to allow everything to dry completely once again, because we're going to be moving into phase number 5, where we're going to be focusing on pushing the very darkest, deepest shadow areas. And I don't actually activate this final layering of color with water, because I'm going to be doing more layering only in the deepest, darkest shadow areas, and I'm leaving lots and lots of that work that I've already done shining through in lighter midtones and lightest light sections. This leads to that combination of painterly effects and more textured lines and marks left behind by those pencils. I'm starting to push and add more contrast in the deepest, darkest shadow shapes. And because in this part of the process we're really just focusing on the very darkest areas, I'm only going to be using the 3 colors that I have chosen to develop my darkest values, which are my 2 browns and my purple. And I'm going to be using these three colors and doing work simultaneously on the basket and in the pears. So right here you can see me go in with my darkest brown. This is my Van Dyke brown, and I am doing even more layering in the darkest shadow areas that I'm able to see in that reference photo. Right around here, I'm almost done with this darkest brown, and I'm going to switch on over to my lighter brown to work on transitions. So wherever I feel that I need to soften that transition between darkest values and midtones, maybe add an extra step between a very dark shadow shape and a lighter value area, that's where I'm going in with this lighter brown. As I am continuing to layer this lighter brown in darker value areas and I'm making my way towards the lighter value areas, I am making sure to exert less and less pressure as I'm making my way into the lighter values. And finally, I am going to go ahead and grab my purple, and I am going to use this purple to do my final carving out of darkest value areas all throughout the piece, both outside of the pears and inside of the pears. By using my purple to really carve out and deepen and darken those darkest shadow areas in all of the different elements in this piece, it definitely creates a more interesting effect because I'm bringing in an extra color that is not actually in that reference photo, and that is complementary to a lot of the colors that I have used in the piece. And because I am pushing that contrast in the darkest areas further, I am enhancing that realism and really starting to make things pop. You can see how I am continuing to jump around the entire piece, and I am really seeing everything as a whole at this point, and making sure that I've developed that wide range of both values and hues that I was wanting to create since the beginning. At this point in the process, if I want to go in and add some textural marks, I can go in and do that as well. All right, so we are in the last phase. This is phase number 6. This is where we're going to be adding our cast shadow and occlusion shadow on the surface that these objects are on. Adding shadow on the surface that the objects are on is very important because it's going to make things look more realistic. It's going to situate these objects on a surface. It's going to further enhance that sense of volume and mass because in real life, the things we have around us are three-dimensional structures that create shadows on the surfaces that they are on or on other objects around them when they are blocking that light from hitting them or reaching them. So just a moment ago, you saw me test out a couple of different grays on my scrap piece of watercolor paper, and I decided to go with this cool gray. So what I am doing right here is I am gently starting to layer this gray on that paper and creating a shape that is similar to what I see in that reference photo for that cast shadow. Once I have that initial lighter layer in, I layer a little bit more of this gray nearest the objects here in the occlusion shadow area. The occlusion shadow is a smaller, darker section within that larger cast shadow shape where the object or the subject is completely blocking or impeding that light from hitting that section of the surface beneath it or next to it. This is why I'm going to make those sections of the cast shadow nearest the objects a little bit darker. And I'm going to do that through layering color in those areas a little bit more. So I layered a little bit more gray in there, but I also went in with my darkest brown, my Van Dyke brown, and layered some of that brown in that darkest occlusion shadow area as well, and left the outer sections of that cast shadow with just a light layer of gray. Once I applied my color in the cast shadow and occlusion shadow areas, you can see me do a little bit of color activation in these areas as well. All of the same things apply with activating the pigment in these areas as well. You can see how I definitely created a lot of splotchiness, but I'm not too worried about this because I'm going to be applying more color on top after this dries. Right here you can see me try to gently fix this splotchiness, but I decided to just leave it be. I'm going to allow everything to dry, and I'm going to come back to layer more color in this area in a little bit. Okay, so after everything has dried, I am going back in and doing more layering in this cast shadow and occlusion shadow area, especially in the darkest occlusion shadow area. First, I create a layer of gray, and with my gray in place, I go in with my darker brown. And I continue layering this brown nearest the objects here, making sure to exert less pressure as I make my way out and away from the objects. And I continue layering this brown, especially in the innermost sections of the cast shadow closest to the subject. I continue doing this layering process, exerting less pressure as I make my way out until I completely cover up that splotchiness. Doing a little bit more layering with my darkest brown here, and in just a bit, I'm going to go back to my gray. And with this gray, I'm just going to work on those transitions where those darker brown values turn into the lighter gray values. Adding that little step in between these two sections with my gray, layering a little bit of this gray on top of that brown. I notice a very, very subtle gray shadow behind the basket. And this is why I also add a little bit of this gray over there. And right here, I'm going to take my kneaded eraser and I'm going to do gentle tapping over some of these areas to remove some of this excess pigment. By this point, you can see how I've gotten rid of that splotchiness, and simultaneously, I've also intensified the occlusion shadow, and I've worked on the variety of values inside of the entire cast shadow. Doing a little bit more layering with my brown nearest the objects here. And then finally, I am going to go in with my purple, and I'm going to do my final deepening and darkening in those occlusion shadow areas using my purple to unify the entire piece. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited, they are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops. All have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much, much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love, love, love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is going to do it for today's video. I really, really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.